Welcome to Innovating Clinical Trials, the podcast designed for clinical research professionals eager to deepen their understanding of clinical trials through concise, insightful segments. Join your hosts, Liam Eves and Ted Trafford, as they uncover the core issues in clinical research, reflect on the industry, and challenge conventional wisdom.
Today's guest is Selin Kurnaz, and Selin is the founder and CEO of Massive Bio. Massive Bio is an artificial intelligence-powered platform that connects cancer patients to clinical trials. So in today's session, Selin, Ted, and I are going to talk and explore about the awareness, access, and process for enrollment, learn about the last mile, and provide lessons to tech startups, understand stakeholder motivations, and so much more. It's a really fun one, and we had a lot of fun recording it. Hope you enjoy it. A question I had that relates to this is that a lot of organizations, a lot of people in the industry won't understand that it takes 41 steps to do, to process. And Ted and I talk a lot about it. We tend to brand things like recruitment as part of an enrollment process, or we say that recruitment and enrollment seem to be the same thing. They interchangeably use. When in actual fact, as you mentioned, enrollment is a series of steps, 41 steps in your case, to enroll a patient. Recruitment might be one of those aspects. So that's something where I see a lot of people perhaps get it wrong, maybe it's just the language and things like that. But where do you see most pharma or biotech companies get it wrong when it comes to oncology trials?
Yeah, I think there are almost like two areas that I want to talk about that. One of them is that, I think there are a lot of things that they get it wrong, but I also believe that it's not intentional that they get it wrong. So what I wanted to mention is that the pharma industry, has been operationalizing the clinical trial enrollment through the CROs, and they basically mine their patients at the site. And based on that, they look at the ineligibility reasons or prescreening failures at the site and say, okay, this is the reason from a clinical standpoint why these patients didn't make the mark in order to go into clinical trial. They have very limited information about what happens operationally that make that failure in terms of that patient to enroll into a clinical trial. And then in that internal CRO process, very, very limited information in terms of the, why it is even happening. But in my standpoint, to a certain extent, if you provide the right resources to the site, if you provide the right support, you somehow resolve those issues at the site. But to me, the biggest issue is that how to even make that patient's road to the site. When the patient's at the site, that's okay. But a lot of the patients are not at the site even. So my basically thing that we have to educate the pharma, which before Massive Bio, it was completely a blank space, is that where is the very primary identification of that patient? Is that patient, identified at the specialty pharmacy? Is that patient, found at the prior authorization unit? Is that patient found at the patient advocacy group? How do you actually basically tell your voice that there is a clinical trial options available? So how do you make it aware to the patient? So that's kind of the point number one. Once they're aware of the patient, how do you engage, educate that patient about these options? And then how do you prescreen the real reasons of the clinical infeasibility and the operational feasibility? And tell the pharma, because when I show the funnel, pharma is falling from their channel. They can't believe that they can't understand that how that many patients, like thousands of patients that has been identified, when they go through the inclusion criteria, exclusion criteria, comes into this like a very small number of patients. And then when you add these operational issues and the last mile combined with that effect, ends up with a handful of patients. The funnel is incredibly steep. So even the providing the transparency to pharma, to all the steps that is actually happening in the very front end of this process is already a game changer from the traditional way of doing business with CRO and sitting at the sites.
Yeah.
Well, I think
I love that.
Yeah. As you were speaking, one of the things that jumped out at me is that really one of the things we're talking about is reframing how we even do feasibility and site selection in studies. Because the typical pharma approach is they'll identify institutions they want to approach, and they'll go and they'll discuss, how many potential candidates you might have, and then they'll select them based on, a formula. But what we're talking about here is essentially, well, let's almost identify the patients first and where they're coming from. And then maybe what we do is geographically set up clinical trial sites that are more convenient for where most of the patients are going to be.
It's such an interesting. I've always called this the iceberg, Selin, is that you effectively, these organizations only see above the waterline, when in actual fact it's the things that happen underneath that are the most valuable and the most interesting and complex, because as we said before, there's two problem statements. There's one of them is a volume perspective, and the other one is an individualization one that requires patients to be taken through a series of steps. And if only, let's say, for instance, rule of thumb, around 50% of patients are coming from sites, that's still a complicated process for sites to go through. But then when you compound on where are those other 50% of patients coming from and what are the steps and points to access them, I think it starts to become very clear very quickly to pharma that there's a lot of work that happens under there. And it's one of the areas Ted and I have spoken about this before, where I think sites are just not reimbursed enough for those series of steps that they do at that stage. And to your point around actually putting the time and effort in below the waterline is the thing that enables results when you reach the waterline.
Yeah, you also need to definitely change the process for feasibility, because those are very, like standard questions, and people are, almost arbitrarily, talking about the numbers, but you have to go and actually really prescreen the patients at the site and really understand the current patient volume, and also you really understand the consistency in these patient volume, because it's not like a one and done. You need to basically have a X number of months of patient recruitment timeline. So those things needs to be understood. And the other thing that I wanted to touch on this is that in the trials, for example, for the non-small cell lung cancer right now, we have been contracted for 115 oncology and hematology clinical trials in the last 4 years. And there's a healthy number of clinical trials that we have, for example, in non-small cell lung cancer. And 40% of these non-small cell lung cancer patients that we are recruiting right now is first line. So when a patient is first line, so you're actually going to find those patients from thoracic surgeons or pulmonologists. You're not necessarily going to find that patient at the site. And when that patient, the first line patient, is at the site, the physician is naturally putting that patient into a standard of care immediately. And there is not even an opportunity for evaluation for a clinical trial. So, the intent is wonderful, but the way to be able to find those patients to satisfy that intent is operationally broken. So those are the other things that I think pharma needs to consider. I have these inclusion-exclusion criteria for my trials. I'm targeting for this patient population, but is this patient population realistic to be found? And it doesn't frankly have to be a rare tumor, rare biomarker. I'm talking about non-small cell lung cancer, which is abundant. But some of these, like the workflows is not feasible.
Well, yeah, and I think what's interesting is that you raise up a really good point, which is that the fact that I call them interception points is that research is not necessarily developed for healthcare, and healthcare has to adapt to the research. And to your point, there is that oncologists may not be the primary target for the interception. There may be thoracic surgeons and so on, as you mentioned, and it's taking the time, I think, prior to just kicking things off with a study. Don't rush to get that first patient in. Take the time to strategize and understand the motivations and drivers of patients, the healthcare systems, the interception points, and so on and so forth. Because it's only when you get that time are you able to put in place effective strategies, right, to enroll. So, yeah, it's super interesting. Ted, do you have a question, sir?
Yeah. So, Selin, I was on your website, and you had a message that really spoke to me. Is it okay if I read it to you?
Absolutely.
Okay. So it says, "We founded Massive Bio because we've been in your shoes. We've experienced loved ones battling cancer within a broken healthcare system and knew that there had to be more we could do. We knew about the existence of clinical trials, but couldn't believe how difficult it was to find them and to find the right ones. So we created Massive Bio." So when I read that, it really spoke to me, because so many healthcare systems in countries around the world are indeed broken. I believe that the clinical trial industry, when it comes to enrollment in clinical trials, is also broken when it comes to sharing information about available clinical trials around the world. So I envision oncology trials kind of like a beacon of hope, almost like a lighthouse on the edge of an ocean. And, it's set there to, guide patients and their families. But for some reason, the clinical trial industry has let the lighthouse fall into disrepair. And what could be a bright, shining light is now just all but a twinkle. What do you think the clinical trial industry needs to do to repair this lighthouse?
Yeah, I think there has to be some disruption that needs to happen. But in the healthcare system, as I always tell to my team, is that it's not that easy to go to Mars. We are at the bicycle level of on Earth. Okay, so you need to do some, piece by piece improvement in order to get to the Mars level, because unfortunately you cannot jump to the Mars level. Even if you want it at your heart, the infrastructure doesn't allow you to make that jump. So we are still using fax machine. We are still, using very, very old school things to be able to exchange the data, and so on and so forth. So what I do believe is that there are a couple of things that can be, partitioned and resolved. One thing is that we absolutely need to educate the patients about the clinical trials, and we should not always expect that that should be the job of the healthcare system. So even mega brands are spending like multi-millions of dollars for Super Bowl ads to educate them about a beer ad. But when it comes to the clinical trials, we never get to that point. We only get to that point of recognition for something about the healthcare when there is a COVID, when there is, like a large scale events that needs to happen. But we shouldn't wait that. So that is kind of a one that we need to really come together to create that awareness and education on the patient about the option. So that's point number one. Point number two is that we need to understand the ugly truth that, yes, there are challenges of the clinical finding the right clinical trials at the clinicaltrials.gov, but clinicaltrials.gov is not meant to be a clinical trial search tool. That was being designed, or the initial purpose of the clinicaltrials.gov is completely different than being a clinical trial search tool. So then we converted the clinicaltrials.gov into a clinical trial search tool, and we are constantly disappointed. So we have to understand the totality of the clinicaltrials.gov, and we have to make sure that we have different mechanisms in order to be able to structure the information at clinicaltrials.gov and prescreen those patients at scale. Okay. And then the third thing is that there is no magic. You have to go through the sweat of going through the last mile and resolving the issues one by one in that last mile to make sure that the identification event for a clinical trial gets executed for enrollment. And there is no shortcut for that. There is enablers with technology. There are engagement tools, but you still need to do the hard work. And there is no shortcut for that. So we have to acknowledge it, and we have to put the right foundation. And also keep in mind that the investment level to that last mile is also very low. Pharma wants to discover a molecule. Pharma wants to discover, but there is a very big gap from the discovery for that drug come to the patient on the bedside. So we need to also invest proportionally to the entire value chain from the discovery for the drug to come to that patient. Right now, there is a significant disproportional level of investment. Everybody wants the innovation and invest in innovation, great, but what is the tactical level and what is going to be the investment that's going to go? Because when I talk about last mile, investors start to roll their eyes. They're saying, oh my God, this is service. Oh my God, there's a human being. And I'm like, Microsoft is a $3 trillion company in terms of market cap. And there are still human beings that works in the company. And you should expect that there are human beings that's going to be there. So those are the kind of the areas that we need to do, from the strategy, access, operations, compliance, investment, everything needs to come together.